March 27th, 2004. London, England. 50-year-old Richard Lancelyn Green, considered to be the world's leading expert on Sherlock Holmes, is discovered dead on top of his bed inside his flat. His cause of death is determined to be asphyxiation after he was garrotted with a shoelace which was tightened around his neck with a wooden spoon. Prior to his death, Lancelyn Green told people his life was in danger over a dispute involving a collection of rare documents from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Since there is no definitive evidence pointing towards homicide or suicide, the coroner returns an open verdict, so the exact circumstances of how Lancelyn Green died are never determined. After that, the trail went cold.
Conan Doyle remains one of those writers so intensely stitched into our culture that it's easy not to notice him. The immense talent, passion and literary brilliance that he brought to his work gives him a unique place in English letters. His Holmes stories introduced the wider reading public to more than just the principles of observation and deduction, close reasoning and cunning detective work for which they're celebrated. It was through their blazingly well-written pages that the wider reading public became aware of such things as Mormonism, the Ku Klux Klan, corrupt unions, the mafia, cocaine and opium use, and much else besides from the bloody and macabre underside of Victorian grandeur and empire. He's unique in simultaneously bringing down the curtain on one era and raising one on another, ushering in a genre of writing that, while imitated and expanded, has never been surpassed. His own life as footballer, cricketer, eye surgeon, champion of injustice, investigator of the paranormal, is itself the stuff of legend. Personally, I'd walk a mile in tight boots just to read his letters to the milkman. Richard Lancelyn Green, the world's leading expert on Sherlock Holmes and his creator Arthur Conan Doyle, dedicated his life to collecting an amazing range of material on Holmes and his creator. And it is this extraordinary collection that Richard Lancelyn Green bequeathed to the city of Portsmouth to enable people from all walks of life and from all over the world to enjoy his life's work.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we are traveling back to the United Kingdom to cover a very unique case: the 2004 death of Richard Lancelyn Green. I've received a couple of requests to cover this one over the years, and if you think this case sounds like something out of a Sherlock Holmes story, well, that's pretty much the point. That sound clip you just heard was none other than actor Stephen Fry from a video which is played to introduce an exhibition of the world's largest collection of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle memorabilia at the Portsmouth City Museum. And if I could, I would get Stephen Fry to narrate this entire episode. As you probably know, Conan Doyle was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and this collection was the life's work of Richard Lancelyn Green, who was considered to be the world's foremost scholar on the subject. But ironically enough, his death would turn out to be a perplexing mystery which might have stumped the famous detective himself. Prior to his demise, Lancelyn Green had been fighting hard to prevent the auctioning off of a series of rare documents which had belonged to Conan Doyle, as he was hoping to use this material to punish the definitive biography of the author's life. In fact, he seemed to believe that his own life was being threatened over this whole situation and had been exhibiting paranoid behavior. So there seemed to be two potential explanations here. One, Lancelyn Green was murdered in the most bizarre manner imaginable, or two, he deliberately staged an elaborate suicide in a fashion which could potentially frame one of his rivals for murder. Well, as I'm going to discuss in a little while, the second scenario is not as unlikely as it sounds, but at the same time, it would have been really difficult for Lancelyn Green to end his life this way, as suicide by garrotting is extremely rare. This is why the coroner ultimately decided to return an open verdict, and opinions about this case are divided to this day. So on this episode, I am essentially going to attempt to play the role of Sherlock Holmes and deduce what the most logical conclusion might be. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the strange death of Richard Lancelyn Green. Our story begins in London, England in 2004, and our central figure is 50-year-old Richard Lancelyn Green, who lives alone in a luxury flat in the Kensington district. Originally born in the small town of Bebington, Richard's father, Roger Lancelyn Green, was a fairly prominent biographer and children's writer, but after first being introduced to the character at a very young age, Richard's primary passion became the iconic fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. Lancelyn Green would devote the next 4 decades of his life to Holmes, as well as the character's creator, legendary author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Starting in the 1980s, Lancelyn Green published several Sherlock Holmes anthologies and co-edited a comprehensive 700-page bibliography about Conan Doyle, as well as a series of collections containing previously unpublished writings from the author. In total, Lancelyn Green was responsible for creating around 200 publications about Holmes and Conan Doyle, and built up a reputation for being the world's foremost scholar and expert on these topics. He had also assembled a massive personal collection of Conan Doyle documents and memorabilia that contained around 16,000 items and was believed to be worth nearly £3 million. Lancelyn Green's ultimate passion project was to create the definitive biography of Conan Doyle's life, which he expected to be 3 volumes long. He hoped the biography would contain a lot of never-before-seen material from the author, but Lancelyn Green would not get the opportunity to complete his project. At around noon on March the 27th, Richard's older sister, Priscilla West, showed up at his flat to check on him. The previous evening and earlier that morning, Priscilla had made numerous attempts to phone Richard, but was unsuccessful at reaching him. Curiously, whenever she got his answering machine, she did not hear her brother's recorded greeting, but rather an American voice which simply said, "Sorry, not available." When Richard failed to answer the front door, Priscilla decided to contact the police, who soon arrived and broke down the door to enter the flat. It wasn't long before they discovered Richard's body lying face down on his bed. Some Sherlock Holmes books and posters, a couple of stuffed toys, and a partially empty bottle of gin were found next to him. He had a black shoelace wrapped around his neck, which was tied to a wooden spoon. Since Lancelyn Green's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, it appeared that someone had used the spoon to tighten the shoelace in order to garrotte him to death. The last known person to have seen Lancelyn Green alive was a younger man named Lawrence Keene. Even though there was a 20-year age difference between them, the two men had been involved in a relationship several years earlier. This came as a complete surprise to Richard's family, who had no idea that he was even gay until after his death, but Lawrence continued to remain friends with him after the relationship ended. On the evening of March 26th, Richard and Lawrence went out for dinner together, and Lawrence said that Richard consumed a lot of wine before they returned to his flat for coffee. According to Lawrence, Richard seemed depressed throughout the evening, as he claimed an American was, quote-unquote, trying to bring him down. As they were leaving the restaurant, Richard pointed to a car behind them and said they were being followed. When they arrived at his flat, Richard insisted that they speak outside in the garden because he believed the place had been bugged by this American, and sometime after Lawrence left, Richard wound up dead. Lancelyn Green's reference to an American seemed to be connected to a dispute he had been involved with prior to his death. Like I mentioned earlier, Lancelyn Green was hoping to publish the definitive biography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and include large amounts of unpublished material from the author. Well, it turned out that an archived collection of around 3,000 never-before-seen items from Conan Doyle, including his private papers, letters, and manuscripts, were scheduled to be sold off at the British auction house Christie's on May the 19th for approximately £2 million. The legal situation surrounding the collection was pretty complicated, as one of the author's sons, Adrian Conan Doyle, had been his literary executor and had made a pact with the rest of the family to keep the collection locked up at a chateau Adrian owned in Switzerland. However, without their knowledge, Adrian removed the collection and was planning to sell the items off to private collectors, but before he could do so, he suffered a fatal heart attack in 1970. Following Adrian's death, his sister, Dame Jean Conan Doyle Bremette, became literary executor, and the collection would remain locked in a solicitor's office in London for the next 2 decades. During the 1990s, Lancelyn Green became friends with Dame Jean, who gave him a glimpse of her father's collection, but could not allow him to read the material because of an ongoing family dispute. Dame Jean told Lancelyn Green that she was planning to bequeath it to the British Library, where it would be accessible to the public, but when she passed away in 1997, the library never received the collection, and it would not be seen for years. It turned out that shortly before she died, Dame Jean had made a last-minute decision to make a deed of apportionment, which wound up splitting the collection between herself and 3 heirs of her former sister-in-law, Anne Conan Doyle, who had been Adrian's widow before she died in 1991. Instead of transferring the collection to the British Library, the surviving heirs decided it would be auctioned off at Christie's instead. Since there was a good chance many of the items would be purchased by private collectors and be inaccessible to scholars like Lancelyn Green or the general public, he attempted to put a stop to the auction. Lancelyn Green was convinced that the collection had been stolen from Dame Jean, but was unable to produce any evidence to support his allegations, so the auction would still go ahead as planned. According to Richard's sister Priscilla, he had become very stressed about the whole situation in the weeks prior to his death. The last time she spoke to him, Richard told her that he hadn't slept in several days and felt like he was trapped in a quote-unquote Kafka-esque world. In fact, he even told Priscilla that he couldn't even be sure if it was actually her that was phoning him. Richard also sent Priscilla a strange note containing 3 names and telephone numbers, along with the words, quote, "Please keep these numbers safe." There were numerous reported instances of paranoid and erratic behavior from Lancelyn Green during this time period, as he told a number of friends and acquaintances that he was being followed around by an American, and he seemed to believe that his attempts to stop the auction had put his life in danger. In fact, Lancelyn Green even told one person that he believed he was being spied on by the Pentagon. The American whom Lancelyn Green seemed to feel threatened by was John Lellenberg, who was actually working at the Pentagon as a policy strategy analyst in the office of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld at that time. However, Lellenberg was almost as passionate about Sherlock Holmes as Lancelyn Green, as he had authored a number of books about Holmes and helped represent Conan Doyle's literary estate in America. In the past, Lellenberg had actually collaborated with Lancelyn Green on some articles about Holmes before they had a falling out sometime in the 1990s. According to Lellenberg, prior to Dame Jean's death, her friendship with Lancelyn Green wound up being fractured when she found out he was representing himself differently in print than he had towards her in person, though some of Lancelyn Green's friends would say that Lellenberg intentionally played on Dame Jean's sensitivities about her father's reputation in order to help drive a wedge into her relationship with Lancelyn Green. Whatever the case, Lellenberg was in London on the week Lancelyn Green died, as he was helping to curate the Conan Doyle collection for the upcoming auction at Christie's. Lellenberg also attended a meeting for the Sherlock Holmes Society of London on the evening of March the 24th, and while Lancelyn Green had also been planning to attend, he changed his mind at the last minute after telling a friend of his that he did not want to go if Lellenberg was there. Of course, Lellenberg denied Lancelyn Green's allegations that he had been following him. He said he had no knowledge about his death and claimed he had not even spoken to Lancelyn Green in a year. Ironically enough, Lellenberg's alibi on the night of Lancelyn Green's death was that he was taking a Jack the Ripper tour with his wife. Now, Lancelyn Green's implication that he was being threatened by an American initially seemed interesting, since his sister Priscilla had heard an American voice on his answering machine when she attempted to phone him before the discovery of his body. However, there turned out to be a logical explanation for this, as Lancelyn Green's own answering machine message had recently been deleted, and since the machine was made in the United States, it would automatically insert a generic, built-in recorded message of an American-sounding voice which said, "Sorry, not available." Priscilla also confirmed that the note her brother had sent her about keeping people safe turned out to be meaningless, as it contained the names and phone numbers for 2 reporters and an employee from Christie's who had no real connection to his death at all. Since there were no signs of forced entry at Lancelyn Green's flat and nothing appeared to have been stolen, police did not initially suspect that a homicide had taken place, as they did not conduct any forensic tests at the flat or check for fingerprints. The possibility was explored that Lancelyn Green might have staged an elaborate suicide, so before the official inquest took place, the Westminster coroner, Dr. Paul Knapman, asked if there were any deaths in Sherlock Holmes stories which were similar to the circumstances of how Lancelyn Green died. It turned out that none of them featured any deaths by garrotting, though one story featured a brief reference to a henchman who worked for Holmes's arch-nemesis Professor James Moriarty and was described as a quote-unquote garrotter by trade. But interestingly enough, there was a Sherlock Holmes short story with a plotline involving a character who staged their own suicide in order to frame a rival for murder. The story in question was titled The Problem of Thor Bridge and involved a woman named Maria Gibson being found dead on Thor Bridge with a gunshot wound to the head, as well as a note in her possession written by her children's governess asking to meet at that location. When a recently discharged revolver is found in the governess's wardrobe, it initially seems like a pretty cut-and-dried case of murder, but when Holmes investigates the crime, he concludes that an elaborate frame-up job took place as revenge for the governess having an affair with Mr. Gibson. It turns out that the revolver found in the governess's wardrobe was not actually the murder weapon, as Mrs. Gibson had fired off a shot and planted it there. She then traveled to Thor Bridge and tied a rock on a piece of string to the end of another revolver. When Mrs. Gibson shot herself, she arranged things so that the rock would pull the revolver over the side of the bridge into the water, which is why it could not be found at the scene. Since Lancelyn Green had been planting seeds about his life being threatened by an American, this led to speculation that he may have used the plot of The Problem of Thor Bridge as inspiration to stage his suicide in hopes that John Lellenberg might be falsely accused of his murder. While many of Lancelyn Green's friends and family found it unlikely that he would have taken his own life, as he had no known history of depression and did not leave a note behind. Richard's older brother, Sir Arthur Lancelyn Green, even stated, quote, "It doesn't seem like suicide in that there's no note. He was very organized and tidy. I can't believe he would have done something without leaving some kind of evidence. It's entirely possible he was murdered, that's all I can say." End quote. Richard's mother was also still alive at the time, and since they had a very close relationship, his family did not believe he would have subjected her to this type of grief. On the day before he died, Lancelyn Green had also made plans with one of his friends to take a holiday in Italy the following week. Since a partially empty bottle of gin was found on the bed next to Lancelyn Green's body, and he had already spent the evening consuming a lot of wine at dinner, there was some question about whether he would have been too intoxicated to stage an elaborate suicide. He also wore slip-on shoes, which did not have laces on them, so there was some question about where the shoelace around his neck originated from. During the inquest, Sir Colin Barry, the president of the British Academy of Forensic Sciences, testified that during his 30-year career, he had only seen one documented case of suicide via garrotting. When the inquest reached its conclusion, Dr. Knapman ultimately decided to return an open verdict on Lancelyn Green's death. While he believed that suicide was the most logical explanation, Knapman acknowledged that garrotting was a very painful, difficult, and unusual method for a person to kill themselves, and that if Lancelyn Green attempted to do so, he may have passed out before he asphyxiated. Investigators from Scotland Yard never attended the inquest, and even though homicide could not be completely ruled out, they said they would only reopen the investigation into Lancelyn Green's death if new evidence pointing to foul play came to light. The auction of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's collection still went ahead as planned at Christie's, but it turned out that Dame Jean had not actually allotted some of the most important documents in the collection to her former sister-in-law's heirs. As a result, this material would wind up in the hands of the British Library, who also purchased additional documents at the auction themselves. In an ironic turn of events, the library would make a good portion of the Conan Doyle collection accessible to the public, which is what Lancelyn Green wanted all along. In his will, Lancelyn Green decided to bequeath his own large collection of Conan Doyle memorabilia to the Portsmouth Library Service, as Conan Doyle once had a medical practice in Portsmouth and he wrote his first 2 Sherlock Holmes books there. It would take 12 truckloads to transport Lancelyn Green's entire collection to Portsmouth, and it is currently on display for the public at an exhibition at the Portsmouth City Museum, where it is accompanied with an introduction video by the patron of the collection, Stephen Fry. Unfortunately, there are still no conclusive answers about Lancelyn Green's death, and in the words of his sister Priscilla, quote, "I don't think we'll ever know for sure what really happened. Unlike in detective stories, we have to live without answers," end quote. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, needless to say, I think it was probably inevitable that The Trail Went Cold would eventually cover a case which had a direct connection to Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I've covered quite a few mysteries on this podcast which are incredibly baffling and seem to lack a logical solution, so much so that I've joked on more than one occasion that not even Sherlock Holmes himself could figure out how to solve these cases. And I suppose it's only appropriate that Richard Lancelyn Green, a man who could easily be classified as the most devout Holmes expert in the world at the time he was alive, would die in a fashion which might have even stumped the master sleuth himself. There's a very famous quote from Holmes which definitely applies here. Quote, "When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." End quote. Yes, it might seem improbable that Lancelyn Green would stage an elaborate suicide to give off the impression he was murdered, but it's technically not impossible. So does that mean it's the truth? Well, on the other hand, an unknown assailant using a wooden spoon to garrote Lancelyn Green with a shoelace also seems improbable, but it's not impossible either. This is the main reason the coroner decided to return an open verdict in this case, because even though he personally leaned towards suicide, the circumstances of Lancelyn Green's death made it impossible for him to conclude this with 100% certainty. The best source of information about this case is a very extensive article in the New Yorker magazine titled Mysterious Circumstances, which was published by journalist David Gran in December of 2004. It's a lengthy but incredibly fascinating read, as it goes into great detail about Richard Lancelyn Green's life and death, and does a deep dive into the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and the world's immense fascination with the character. In a way, the article is almost structured like a murder mystery, as it presents a number of baffling details about Lancelyn Green's death, but then comes up with a logical explanation for some of them by the end. For instance, there's the fact that Lancelyn Green's message on his answering machine had been replaced by a recording of an American-sounding voice. He had expressed his belief that an American was following him around and potentially threatening his life, but what kind of killer is literally going to leave their voice behind at the crime scene? But of course, this voice turned out to be nothing more than an automated pre-recorded greeting which was already built into the answering machine, so it makes you wonder if Lancelyn Green made the calculated decision to erase his own greeting in order to make his death seem more mysterious than it was. At the beginning of the article, some people from Lancelyn Green's personal life are 100% convinced he was murdered, but gradually change their tune once they give the whole situation more thought. One of these people is a longtime friend and collaborator named John Gibson, who eventually becomes convinced that Lancelyn Green decided to stage his suicide to create the perfect mystery. And Gibson makes a very valid point when he states, quote, "If someone else had garroted him, why would he need the spoon? The killer could simply use his hands," end quote. If Lancelyn Green's death was a suicide inspired by a Sherlock Holmes story, then the ironic postscript to this mystery is that some other works of fiction have been inspired by Lancelyn Green's death. In 2010, author Graham Moore published a novel titled The Sherlockian, which features a plot based around a Sherlock Holmes expert who gets his hands on some lost Conan Doyle manuscripts and winds up dying in the exact same fashion as Lancelyn Green. And incidentally, if you want to play 6 Degrees of Sherlock Holmes, Graham Moore went on to win an Academy Award for writing the screenplay for the 2014 film The Imitation Game, starring Benedict Cumberbatch, who played the title character in the acclaimed TV series Sherlock. In 2019, the theater company, Geffen Playhouse, released a stage play titled Mysterious Circumstances, which was written by Michael Mitnick and named after the aforementioned New Yorker article. Richard Lancelyn Green and Sherlock Holmes are both characters in this play, as Holmes shows up and attempts to solve Lancelyn Green's mysterious death, with Alan Tudyk portraying both characters in a dual role. I also once featured Lancelyn Green's case in a Halloween-themed article I published for Crack.com in October of 2017, titled 6 Utterly Terrifying Unsolved Mysteries No One Can Explain. I referenced the novel The Sherlockian and made a comment about how bizarre it was that we now have books with fictional detectives solving fictional cases based on a real unsolved case, which may have been inspired by a fictional case taken by the fictional Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I think I felt my brain exploding just from typing and reading that sentence out loud. Now, I know that many of Lancelyn Green's friends and family members were adamant that he was not suicidal, since he had never shown any visible signs of depression, but after studying so many cases like this, I have learned this statement doesn't mean all that much, as suicidal people sometimes do not show any indication of being depressed before they surprise everyone by suddenly taking their own life. I mean, Lancelyn Green had clearly been exhibiting paranoid and erratic behavior prior to his death, and the last known person to see him alive, Lawrence Keene, even stated that Lancelyn Green appeared to be depressed when they had dinner together shortly before he died. It's also interesting how Richard's family was taken by complete surprise when they learned he was gay following his death, and had once been involved in a relationship with Lawrence, which gives me the impression that Richard's relatives may not have known him as well as they thought they did. One friend even stated that there was no way his death was a suicide because of the partially empty bottle of gin found on the bed next to his body. Since Lancelyn Green was an enophile and had consumed a lot of wine at dinner that night, this friend said he never would have followed that up by drinking gin, so therefore, the gin must have been drank by someone else who was at the flat. But people sometimes do very unpredictable things when they decide to end their life, and perhaps Lancelyn Green needed the combination of wine and gin to give himself the necessary liquid courage to garrote himself. It's clear that the upcoming auction of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle collection at Christie's was taking an enormous personal toll on Lancelyn Green, so much so that he genuinely seemed to believe that his attempts to stop the auction were putting his life in danger, and his paranoia had become so strong that he started becoming distrustful of his friends. Prior to his death, one of the people Lancelyn Green spoke to on the phone was Nicholas Utekin, the editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal. Lancelyn Green had asked him to find a recording of an old BBC radio interview in which one of Conan Doyle's heirs had allegedly stated that his collection should be left to the British Library. When Utekin managed to track down a copy of the recording and called Lancelyn Green to let him know that no such statement had been made, Lancelyn Green snapped and accused Utekin of conspiring against him. Lancelyn Green's ultimate goal was to publish the definitive 3-volume biography of Conan Doyle, which covered virtually everything in the author's life, but he did not believe he could complete this project unless he got access to all the never-before-seen materials in the collection. Of course, what makes this story extra tragic is that most of these documents still wound up in the possession of the British Library, who made it available to the public, so if Lancelyn Green had lived, he would have been able to access the material and possibly completed his project. However, I get the sense that even if you disregard the situation with the auction, Lancelyn Green was starting to become disillusioned with Conan Doyle in general. It seems that in the years prior to his death, Lancelyn Green grew very frustrated over the inability of Conan Doyle's heirs to come to an agreement about what to do with his collection, that he started to openly lash out at Conan Doyle himself. One friend heard Lancelyn Green refer to Conan Doyle as, quote-unquote, unoriginal and a plagiarist, while another claimed he once said, quote, I've wasted my whole life on a second-rate writer. So you have to wonder if Lancelyn Green was just having some sort of midlife crisis over his passion project, which was taking a severe toll on his mental health and giving him suicidal thoughts. But now let's talk about Lancelyn Green's allegations that he was being followed and threatened by an American over his attempts to stop the auction. In the aforementioned New Yorker article, David Grand managed to get an interview with the American, and while he requested that his name not be used in the article, it would eventually emerge publicly that he was John Lellenberg. Sadly, Lellenberg passed away in April of 2021, just 5 months before the release of this episode, and you can find numerous tributes to him on various Sherlock Holmes websites, as it sounds like he was a pretty passionate devotee of the character. At the time of Lancelyn Green's death, Lellenberg worked as a policy strategy analyst in the office of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who actually wound up passing away only 2 months after Lellenberg in June of 2021. Now, obviously, Rumsfeld was quite a controversial figure, particularly back in 2004, but I really do not believe that Lellenberg's connection to him has any relevance to this story. During an interview he gave to The Guardian, Lellenberg made it clear that he always kept his passion for Sherlock Holmes separate from his work with the government, stating, quote, "I have no knowledge of why he was paranoid about it. It would be silly and delusional to be concerned about me because the work I do has nothing to do with intelligence and surveillance at any level." End quote. Indeed, while it doesn't sound like Lancelyn Green was on the best of terms with him, I see nothing in Lellenberg's background to suggest he was a murderer, and the idea that the United States government would utilize resources to perform surveillance on a Sherlock Holmes fanatic and stage a covert assassination to prevent him from getting his hands on Conan Doyle memorabilia is pretty outrageous, even by conspiracy theory standards. I don't know if Lancelyn Green was specifically trying to frame anyone for his murder, but if he was, it's reasonable to assume that Lellenberg was his target, and it's possible that he chose that particular week to stage his suicide because he knew Lellenberg would have been in London at that time. Unlike Mrs. Gibson in The Problem of Thor Bridge, Lancelyn Green did not leave any specific evidence behind at the scene which pointed to a specific suspect, so if this was his plan, I'm not sure how he expected it to work. Obviously, the scheme that Mrs. Gibson orchestrated in the story, involving 2 separate revolvers, would not fly in today's day and age, since we can now use ballistics to match bullets to specific guns. But believe it or not, even though it sounds like a fictitious plot device, there have been documented real-life cases of people staging their suicides in order to frame someone for murder, and it has led to innocent people being sent to prison. If you're a fan of Dateline, they released an episode earlier this year titled The Phone Call, which covered the shooting deaths of a couple named Kathleen and Carl Schroll. Before her death, Kathleen made a frantic phone call to her mother, in which he said that a man named Olin Pete Coons had entered her house and shot her husband and was now attempting to kill her too. At the time, Kathleen was involved in a heated legal battle with Pete, so in order to concoct the ultimate revenge scheme and ensure that her heirs would receive life insurance benefits, she shot her husband before fatally shooting herself in the back of the head and planted enough seeds of evidence to convince the authorities that Pete was responsible for the crime. He wound up being charged and convicted of murder and served more than 10 years in prison before it became apparent that he was the victim of an elaborate frame-up job and finally had his conviction vacated. So could Richard Lancelyn Green have attempted the same thing? Well, the obvious difference between these 2 cases is that while shooting yourself in a fashion to make your suicide look like murder is physically possible, garroting yourself to death is a totally different animal. Prior to Lancelyn Green's death, there was apparently only 1 documented case of suicide by garroting in the United Kingdom within the past 30 years, so I guess it's not technically impossible, but it would require a hell of a lot of willpower. Well, before I talk more about that, I do want to mention that as someone who is obsessed with murder mysteries, it is surprising that Lancelyn Green wouldn't have taken additional steps to make his murder look more convincing if he staged the whole thing. One of the biggest points which has been used in favor of the suicide theory is the fact that Lancelyn Green's front door was locked when his body was discovered, and there were no signs of forced entry at his flat. I mean, I don't know the exact layout of the flat, so I guess it's possible that an intruder might have been able to find another exit point besides the front door, but if there's anyone you would expect to take this into account and go to the trouble of unlocking the door or staging a break-in, it would be Lancelyn Green. But hey, the locked room mystery is a very popular subgenre of detective fiction, and some of Conan Doyle's original Sherlock Holmes stories are locked room mysteries, so maybe Lancelyn Green decided he wanted to end his life in dramatic fashion by becoming part of one. However, it bears repeating that the act of wrapping a shoelace around one's neck as a garrote and using a wooden spoon to tighten it until asphyxiation occurs is so unusual that you could use this as an argument to support both homicide and suicide. I do agree with the point that if someone wanted to murder Lancelyn Green, it makes little sense for them to attach a wooden spoon to a shoelace and twist it around, rather than simply using their hands. And how would someone even dream up the idea of committing a murder in this fashion? Did they just show up to Lancelyn Green's flat with a shoelace and a wooden spoon? Or did they improvise with the items they could find? I suppose a counter-argument is that the killer could have staged the most intentionally outlandish murder imaginable in order to make everyone believe that Lancelyn Green completed a very elaborate suicide, but there are much simpler ways to do so. If they had staged a suicide by, say, hanging Lancelyn Green by his neck from a high place, then there would be a lot less skepticism, and this case might be universally accepted as a suicide today. I agree with Dr. Paul Knappman's assessment that suicide is the most logical explanation, but I can also understand why he returned an open verdict because of one big nagging question. Would it have even been physically possible for Lancelyn Green to do this to himself? I don't have any additional information about this other case from the United Kingdom which involves suicide by garroting, but I can only assume that it didn't involve a shoelace and a wooden spoon. The big issue is that there's no real precedent for what happened to Lancelyn Green, and if no one else has died in this fashion, then how do you determine if suicide is feasible? It's generally believed that if you make an attempt to strangle yourself by wrapping your bare hands around your throat and squeezing, you would not be able to complete the act because you will eventually lose consciousness before you asphyxiate, causing you to loosen your grip. I'm sure the same thing would happen if you wrapped a shoelace or rope around your neck and tried using your hands to tighten it and strangle yourself. Unless you tie the ligature to something to create momentum, sooner or later you will pass out. But if you tied a wooden spoon to a ligature around your neck and kept twisting it around to create more pressure, would you be able to create enough necessary force to garrote yourself before you passed out? Lancelyn Green was found face down on his bed, so if he did this to himself, he was likely in a standing position while he twisted the spoon before he lost consciousness and fell forward onto the bed. If the spoon stayed in place and kept exerting pressure and cutting off Lancelyn Green's air supply after he passed out, then maybe he wound up being asphyxiated. While one could argue that his high consumption of wine and gin would have made him too intoxicated to do something like this, it also could have numbed him enough that he was able to endure inflicting this type of pain on himself before he died. I guess the alternate explanation is that this was an assisted suicide, as Lancelyn Green could have invited someone into his flat to garrote him on his behalf. But unless he paid them a substantial amount of money, I cannot imagine why anyone would agree to go along with this, and again, using the spoon wouldn't have been necessary. The final possibility which has been explored is that Lancelyn Green's death could have been the result of some sort of sex game gone wrong. His former lover, Lawrence Keane, was asked if Lancelyn Green had ever used strangulation as a form of sexual behavior, but Lawrence denied that he had ever seen him do that. If Lancelyn Green was a victim of autoerotic asphyxiation and was accidentally strangled to death by a sexual partner, you can understand why they would have fled the scene once they realized what happened, but no evidence was ever found to indicate that he engaged in sexual activity that night. One thing's for certain, if Lancelyn Green wanted his death to be the ultimate unsolvable mystery, which could not even be cracked by Sherlock Holmes himself, then he certainly achieved his goal. Even though many people do believe this was a suicide, it will never officially be classified as one unless additional evidence surfaces. Unfortunately, since this was never treated as a homicide investigation by the police, evidence which might have shed some light on what happened was overlooked. If the shoelace, the spoon, or the gin bottle were ever tested for fingerprints or DNA, this could have turned up evidence pointing to an outside party if it actually existed. But since this did not take place, we'll never know for certain, and unless new evidence were to surface pointing to homicide, the police will never perform a full-fledged investigation. Personally, I do think the most logical explanation is that Lancelyn Green's death was an elaborate suicide and a sad ending to an otherwise fascinating life. I'm using the same logic here that I apply towards the Ray Rivera case from Unsolved Mysteries, which I also covered on The Trail Went Cold last year. If you're skeptical about an official suicide ruling, try to put together an alternate scenario involving homicide and determine if it makes more or less sense. Even though there were strange anomalies in the Ray Rivera case, I ultimately thought it made a lot more sense that he jumped off the roof of that hotel on his own, rather than being pushed or thrown that distance by an outside party. The same logic applies to Richard Lancelyn Green's death. There are strange anomalies which point away from suicide, but it ultimately makes more sense than a scenario where some unknown killer garrotted him to death with a shoelace and a wooden spoon and managed to escape a locked flat. And you also have to ask yourself, if Lancelyn Green wasn't murdered by a crazed Conan Doyle fan who was trying to prevent him from stopping the auction, then who could have done this and what was their motive? I think in this situation, you just have to revisit that famous quote from Sherlock Holmes, quote, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth," end quote. However, in spite of the tragic circumstances of how he died, I definitely think that Richard Lancelyn Green's life should be celebrated, as no one was more devoted to preserving the legacies of Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and it's nice that Lancelyn Green's legacy is being preserved by publicly displaying his massive Conan Doyle collection at the Portsmouth City Museum. While his death was certainly tragic, I'm sure he would be satisfied to know that he will be forever linked to his greatest passion. All that being said, should you happen to have any information to suggest that the death of Richard Lancelyn Green was not a suicide and that foul play was involved, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about the bizarre 1934 ransom kidnapping of June Robles, who was found alive inside a metal box in the desert, but her kidnappers were never caught, and there's been some debate about whether the whole thing might have been an elaborate hoax. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved disappearance of convenience store clerk Deborah Poe. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Aaron A., Cheryl H., Simon J., and Emily M. Thank you so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Tapes from the Dark Side.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
Tapes from the Dark Side
is an awesome new true crime podcast.
What motive could a father have for hurting his own son? What dark secret is Mark Redwine hiding? In Season 1, the host T.Z. Borden investigates the curious case of a missing 13-year-old boy and the father suspected of murder. Please go search Tapes from the Dark Side on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
You should give it a good listen.
I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to get a discount. So to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. That's crimecon.com and the promo code is TRAIL. In addition, I also wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music here on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.